Hey guys, it's Dave. Happy Friday. Thank you for watching as always. Today we're going to be talking about Rocket Lab and specifically what potential catalysts are out there on the horizon that could end up moving the stock in the future, as well as being big for the overall company, which is frankly my bigger concern, making sure the overall company is still operating well and is still a company I want to be invested in. If that continues to be true, then the stock price will continue to follow. If you're new here, I do hope you'll consider subscribing by the end of the video if you do find it interesting, and if you're not new, well, thank you for continuing to watch, and I will check out your comments down below. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about Rocket Lab's upcoming catalysts. So if you want the TLDR version, I guess you can just look at this chart. This is not a completely comprehensive list, as I suppose you could add on Electron launches, perhaps the first reused Electron or something like that. But personally, I don't think Electron is nearly as big of a deal to the company as it used to be, so I didn't include those on there. And I'm sure there's some others as well that you can think of to include. Let me know down below which ones you think I've missed, but these are the main ones that came to mind, so let's go through them in order. Starting off with Mars sample return, the one that is probably the least likely to actually happen, but if it does happen, I think it's an absolute game changer for the company. We're talking like complete trajectory altering stuff, really changing how the overall industry thinks of the company. It's also a massive dollar figure at about $2 billion of revenue, which is about double the current total backlog of the entire company. Now, certainly they would outsource some of that stuff and subcontract it, but it would be nonetheless a massive revenue driver for the company and just an extremely exciting mission. If you're not too familiar with it, I did make a full video on this earlier that I spent a lot of time on, so I'd encourage you to check that out. But the gist of it is there's a rover on the surface of Mars right now, which has collected a bunch of different samples from different areas of the surface and put them into little capsules, but they don't have a way of getting the capsules back to Earth. There were some initial plans that ended up going over cost and over budget, so NASA is back to the drawing board. They've asked for proposals from industry on potential ways and architectures that this could work. Important to keep in mind, Rocket Lab is one of about 8 companies that submitted proposals, and they were awarded a study to throw some resources at this and make sure they could do it. So yeah, definitely far from a sure thing, but you know, one of 8 proposals plus a few internal proposals as well. And the other thing to keep in mind is that NASA doesn't necessarily have to go with one of these 8. They can read all these studies and say, oh, that's a good idea, and take aspects from different ones and implement it however they want. But Rocket Lab's proposal does seem to be coming in on the cheaper end, so I do think they have a better chance than some of these other companies. I give them maybe a 1 in 4, 1 in 5 odds. With a big NASA project like this that gets a ton of publicity, there's usually politics around it too, though, and of course SpaceX has bid their Starship. Really anyone's guess on where this goes. We should definitely keep an eye on it, and if it does happen, it would be massive. As you can see from the title of this article, the decision should be made by the end of the year on a new approach. So fairly near-term potential catalyst, and if it does happen, extremely massive. I'd put it maybe the biggest on the list, just also considering the fact of how unsure it is. I think the impact, if it did happen, would be even larger because of that. Next up, we have Tranche 3 of the NSSL program, launch contracts, that is. And I've talked about this ad nauseum. This has also been subject to all sorts of campaigns by people trying to keep Rocket Lab out. And basically what the NSSL is a ton of U.S. government and military launches pooled into one big pool. From that, they allow certain rockets to bid on individual task orders coming from this pool and get massive contracts. Right now, the only 3 rockets that are allowed in, that have been allowed in, are the Falcon 9, the New Glenn, and the ULA Vulcan. Not to get into too much detail, there's 2 different lanes, and Neutron would be in lane 1 if it did get approved. But basically, as long as the committee believes Neutron has a credible path to launching by the end of 2025, December 2025, then they should on-ramp into this program. It is absolutely massive. Lane 1 is projected at $5.6 billion over 5 years. Just an insane amount of launches that Rocket Lab could really use for Neutron, even if they get just a small portion of it. I mean, look at this. SpaceX just won a first round of Lane 1 task orders, and that's worth alone $733 million. We're talking about Electron looking to make maybe like $140 million in a year currently, and this is $733 million just on the first round of Lane 1 task orders. Really massive, and there's no reason Rocket Lab shouldn't get in 2025, in my opinion, given the progress they've shown on Neutron. And, you know, it's not like their target is December 2025 and they're just trying to barely get in. Their target is like June 2025. So even if they miss by a few months, you'd think that would be plenty of cushion to get in. Anyway, proposals are due this year by December 13th. Awards are expected by spring 2025. So you better believe spring 2025, we will be watching out closely to see if Neutron gets on-ramped. I don't think Firefly or Relativity have as much of a chance this time around as maybe the following year. We'll have to see on how their programs shape up. But I think Rocket Lab, even as the article says, stands out with the Neutron vehicle anticipated to be ready for its first flight mid-2025. So that would be very exciting, a massive catalyst for the company, and definitely should move the stock. Because of that, I'm saying the potential impact is large. I don't consider it as massive as Mars sample return, just because I think of it as more of a foregone conclusion in that it will happen eventually. It's only a matter of when, whereas Mars sample return is more of a low probability but high impact event. And spring 2025 is the timeline to look out for on this one. Next up, of course, is Neutron's first launch, something we all have been talking about for ages, something that will open up a whole new world. For Rocket Lab in terms of getting access to the medium launch market. Definitely a lot more demand than in small launch. They can compete with Falcon 9. They can start operating their own constellation and launching it into orbit themselves, climbing up the value chain, adding a lot of revenue potential, even just for launch itself. Each individual launch is $55 million versus just a measly $8 million for Electron. So that very quickly adds a ton of revenue to the top line of the company. And you better bet that it's going to be a big media event, meaning there's going to be a lot of coverage, a lot of people talking about the company, probably some pretty big live streams, and hopefully that will as well have an impact on the stock. Of course, if it explodes, it could be a negative impact, but it's sure to be exciting either way. And personally, I have a lot of confidence in Peter Beck and the team he's assembled at Rocket Lab. So no surprises on that one. It is a very large potential impact. Again, probability, I would say medium to high. Wouldn't shock me at all if it gets pushed a little bit later. Maybe, no rocket seems to launch on time. So whether it's a few months late or more, we'll see. But the key is having the credible path to launch in 2025 and ideally actually launching in 2025. So that is the next catalyst on our list. Okay, next up, another high probability item that, at least in my opinion, is high probability. This is the SDA Tranche 3 contract awards. If you'll remember, not too long ago, Rocket Lab received their first prime contractor award from the SDA to build out a constellation of satellites. This was worth over $500 million, really put Rocket Lab on the map as one of the primes, and is really a big deal and a company-changing contract. Obviously, you're looking at a backlog of $1 billion. $500 million is half of the entire backlog of the company. So why are we talking about this now if I'm telling you about a contract that's already happened? Well, it happens in tranches, and what they were awarded was a part of Tranche 2. Now, The Space Force is building out this constellation and looking at Tranche 3 next, and they're going to need companies like Rocket Lab to build their satellites for them once again. This is a massive contract, and it won't go just to any one vendor, not Rocket Lab or anyone else. It will get divided up like the previous tranche did, but that means there's plenty of work and contracts for all. We're talking about 200 satellites to be procured by the SDA. The procurement process is expected to begin in 2025, and the SDA is calling for improved and more focused proposals that will enhance the capabilities of their constellation. This is for missile tracking, communications, and defense. So 140 of the satellites will be the transport layer, which provides communications, whereas 54 of the satellites will be for the tracking layer, which detects and tracks missile threats, including hypersonic missiles. The tracking layer satellites are generally more complex and higher paying than the transport layer, but transport layer satellites are what Rocket Lab was contracted for in Tranche 2, but either of them would be absolutely amazing. I would be shocked, completely shocked, if Rocket Lab is not a bidder on this. It would blow me away, in fact, if they didn't have a bid ready to go on this. And I would also be very surprised if they don't at least get their small slice of this deal. Rocket Lab, I think, is known very well for always building their satellites on time with high quality. Government also wants to make sure they have a diverse group of vendors and suppliers, and they do like to spread out those contracts. So I fail to see any reason why Rocket Lab shouldn't get their fair slice of this massive deal. If it was $500 million for the last one, for Tranche 2, I would expect probably at least that much for Tranche 3, and potentially more, so definitely something to keep an eye out, something that would be absolutely massive for the company in terms of revenue, profitability, prestige, and they even mention in the article here that Tranche 1, which Rocket Lab was not a part of, has already faced significant production delays due to component shortages and supply chain bottlenecks, and Rocket Lab, as I said, known for delivering on time and controlling a lot of that supply chain themselves, manufacturing, as we all know, the solar panels, reaction wheels, star trackers, and just the satellite bus. Like, so much of the overall satellite really just missing some of that payload capability. As we saw in the initial contract, they did buy antennas and stuff like that from Redwire, as well as a few others. So that was the next potential massive catalyst, and I put the probability as high on this one. You can let me know how you think, or if you have a different opinion. The potential impact, I should really change this to large as opposed to medium. It's not like a massive company altering event, but it's very big. It's very big, and yeah, I think medium is too low. Timeline, we're talking, I believe, late 2025 to hear more announcements around that, but the draft solicitations are already coming out very soon, and then they'll make some adjustments to those solicitations, and then they'll get the bids in, and then of course there needs to be time to evaluate all the different bids before the SDA makes a decision. And by the way, if you're wondering, where's the launch of all these satellites coming from? Well, it goes back to that NSSL that we talked about previously. All these SDA satellites will fall under the NSSL program, so getting on-ramped with Neutron means that Rocket Lab would have the opportunity to bid for task orders launching these 200 SDA satellites in the future. If you're curious at all about how big this is, well, just look at this. SDA planning to spend $25.5 billion over the next 5 years. Really big for the space industry and for Rocket Lab. Okay, next up, we are talking about Rocket Lab's potential acquisition. So this one, I said, has a medium probability of happening. The potential impact, probably relatively low. We're talking about buying a company worth, I assume, maybe sub $100 million, but certainly not more than, I would say, $300 million. And, this could, improve their capabilities, allow them to not have to outsource those antennas and those payload capabilities, bringing the rest of the satellite manufacturing process in-house, fully vertically integrated and ready to go, building out their own constellation that they will be able to launch with Neutron. How much this will move the stock, I don't know. I guess I would say not massive, but maybe the market likes it and they add some revenue on the books, like they buy a company that's already profitable and bam, you immediately get a little bit of boost to your revenue line, which would be nice. So yeah, I would say low potential impact, relatively speaking. Medium probability of it happening, and timeline, really hard to say. I thought it would have already happened by now, but it hasn't. So now I'm just going to say whenever, wherever. Whenever, wherever, we're meant to be together. Next up on the list is one that I have been looking forward to since I became an investor in Rocket Lab, and that is achieving profitability, first on an EBITDA basis, or earnings before interest, depreciation, and amortization, and then shortly after on a net income basis, they'll be getting profitable and delivering those EPS numbers in their earnings calls. So probability of this happening, well, eventually, I would say almost to certainty, but in terms of the timeline I put here, which is mid-2026, what I'm thinking about right now, we know it won't happen probably until Neutron launches, and then the scuttlebutt is maybe a few quarters after the first launch of Neutron, we get looking towards probably adjusted EBITDA positive before pushing towards net income positive. But yeah, let me know your opinion on it. So mid-2026, medium to high probability of that happening, in my opinion. Potential impact, once again, very large, as once you hit profitability, the business becomes much less risky, and those risk-averse investors, like say the Jim Cramers of the world, start to take notice and take interest in the company. And I've just anecdotally noticed when I watch companies, whenever they go from cash burning to cash generating, there's generally a really big boost in their stock price. I've seen it with Tesla, I've seen it with Palantir, I've seen it with the Redwire and many others. So it would stand to reason, and has been part of my entire thesis, that when this happens, there would be a big boost to Rocket Lab stock. Although, of course, I do have to say, I wasn't expecting Rocket Lab stock to run up quite this much pre-profitability being achieved. So that is a little bit of a curveball, and we'll have to think about that in our evaluations going forward. Finally, the last catalyst I have for you today is a new Globalstar order for satellite buses. This actually just came out today. Announcement was made between Apple and Globalstar. Globalstar stock themselves actually jumped 40% on the news. Let's rewind a little bit. If you don't remember, a while back, the first really big constellation deal Rocket Lab got was from MDA to supply satellite buses, and MDA was the prime contractor for Globalstar, and Globalstar was building out the constellation to support Apple's emergency SOS features. So it's a little bit downstream of Apple, but it's definitely a big impact. If something like $100+ million, no, I think it was $300 million was the total contract, and Rocket Lab was receiving like 130 of that, if I remember correctly. Still a big deal for the company, not as big as it used to be. But what we heard today is that Apple will invest an additional $1.1 billion in upfront infrastructure prepayments to expand satellite service capacity. Apple's also taking a significant stake in Globalstar, 20%. That doesn't really matter so much for Rocket Lab, but what I will say is when you see big companies like an Apple, like an Amazon, some of the biggest companies in the world starting to invest significantly into space, that's when you know you're starting to hit prime time here. And obviously when space expands, Rocket Lab expands, they want to have their logo on everything that goes to space. It would make a lot of sense to me that with this expanded constellation, Rocket Lab may get their satellite buses used again. Still speculation, no proof that this would happen, and Globalstar could select another contractor for their satellites if they wanted to. But to me, it just makes a lot of sense if it were to happen. So for that reason, I would say that the probability is medium. Potential impact, I actually put it as low, because with these SDA deals and NSSL type deals in terms of hundreds and get, over $500 million. 100 odd million is no longer as massive and company changing as it used to be. 2 years ago, I would consider this to be massive or at least large. Now it's more low, but it just goes to show how well the company has done. So we'll have to wait and see on this one. I would just guess on the timeline, maybe within 8 months, we hear something in terms of who's going to be building out these satellites. But that's just a guess on my part. You can let me know your guesses as well down below. So I think we've been a little spoiled by Rocket Lab in terms of a lot of the big contract announcements, and now there's been a little bit of a lull in massive news for the company as we're really just all looking towards that first Neutron launch. But you can see from the potential catalysts here that there is quite an exciting potential roadmap ahead for Rocket Lab. Let me know if you agree with my opinion on these, or if you would add something else to the list, take something off this list. You think the timeline should be different, or you think the impact would be bigger or smaller than I thought. Let's continue the discussion down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do consider hitting that subscribe button, as it's very helpful for the channel. And I hope you have a great day, a great rest of the week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.